Okay, so thank you for inviting me, coming here. I'm, as you said, I'm a professor in design at the Umeå Institute of Design. And if you're not familiar with the school, it's one of the Swedish design schools, but it's kind of particular in that not only is it quite small, it's also only educating industrial designers. So we don't have any other design areas. We have versions of design, industrial design in the master's level, but it's a fairly small school with a narrow topic. That said, my own interest and background extends from having, on one side, a kind of interest in critical practice, experimental design work, speculative design, and on the other, more design philosophical matters, theoretical matters that I also have a strong interest in. So I'm a bit, as you will see, have an interest that cuts across different disciplines and different questions. And so what I like to do today is that I have to admit that I have a somewhat unfortunate habit of proposing topics when getting invitations like this that I end up regretting quite soon after. And that happens also this time. There are things that I've been trying to think about because I feel an urgency around them. And of course, I haven't yet figured out exactly how to deal with them. So what I'm going to do today is to share my struggles so far. And the reason I'm struggling is that I'm trying to get into things that are inherently familiar, things we see already all the time, um, everyday basis, and see if there's something about them that needs to be reconsidered, something about them that somehow creates an itch, and where I think we need to do things differently. So I'm going to do this in three parts. First, I'm going to set up the stage a bit, discuss where this is coming from, give it a bit of a context. Then I'm going to tell you a story. I've called it a Tale of Two Trajectories, but it's in the form of a story of sorts about design aesthetics. And then I'm just going to wrap it up towards the end. And if I'm not entirely mistaken, we will have some time to discuss this when I'm done as well. It is a bit hard with interaction doing this. It feels a lot like me talking to myself here. But if you have questions, try to raise my attention. I have something of a window where that might be possible here. Or else we do the questions afterwards. I might also stop certain points and ask if you're with me so far. So here goes. Um, about these notions, obviously, they're all contested, all difficult, and I think we could spend at least a day just discussing what politics, design, and aesthetics and how they intersect mean. Unfortunately, I'm in good company in this seminar series. You've had already very excellent speakers on these topics. And as Kelly just mentioned, you will have friends and former colleagues of mine speaking next in the series, Marie-Louise next and Romeo thereafter. And I strongly recommend you attend their talks. But this is not what I'm going to tell you today. It doesn't depend on any specific idea about what these concepts mean. We can get along quite well with everyday notions. So politics, let's just start thinking about politics as being about the distribution of possibilities, of goods, of who gets what, when, and how. But not only the decision and the sort of negotiation and contestation around distribution as such, but also very importantly about the ideas, the ideals, the narratives that govern such discussions. And especially, I mean, if we look at politics today and in the sense of party politics, the struggle over what narrative is to be grounding for these decisions is definitely one of the key issues. Design is a wonderful word. We all think we understand and know what it means, and we rarely agree precisely about it. But that's fine. It's a word that tolerates a lot of variation, and for very good reasons, and it also makes it very useful. But what I'm trying to talk about here is where design as the making of things for someone, designing something for someone, and often at a scale where that someone is not just one or two or a few people, but some scale to it, industrial scale even, where it reaches many of which you will never meet or know in person. And then aesthetics, one of the most dangerous words in the business, and yet something we need to address. If you're feeling comfortable with aesthetics, you can think about appearance, experience, appreciation, and similar things. But it has to do with how we relate, how we understand, and how we experience the world. And more specifically, the kinds of experiences that we may associate with strong impressions, traditionally, historically, about beauty, but also other things. It's a term for experiencing. And so when these come to intersect, we could think about, for instance, the work of Jacques Rancière, highlighting that these are actually quite connected. He's done a work on the politics of aesthetics, which I'm partly building on here. And just to exemplify, he understands aesthetics as a matter of the distribution of the sensible. And since you have that notion of distribution in here, we can connect that to the idea of the politics as a matter of distribution. And say, for instance, is saying, by assembling words or forms, people define not merely various forms of art, but certain configurations of what can be seen and what can be thought, certain forms of inhabiting the material world. The way in which, by drawing lines, arranging words, or distributing surfaces, one also designs divisions of communal space. So if we look at classical examples of how these things intersect, just to exemplify it, this is an example used by Langdon Winner when discussing the politics of artifacts. And it's the low overpass bridges to Long Island that Robert Moses designed. And what's particular about these is that it restricted access to these recreational areas outside New York to people who own cars, because the bridges were designed to be so low as to not allow buses, which meant public transport was excluded. And so this has been used as an example of how the distribution of possibility is very materially configured, and in this case, intentionally configured through design. But if we look more generally at where we find ourselves right now, this is going to be a lot about technology. And the reason is partly because it's one of those things right now that's being identified as a driver of change, societal change, social change. There are few countries in the sort of our part of the world who do not have an agenda that points to digitalization as a key factor in how we are moving forward. And at the same time, it's a highly contested agenda. We don't know how to do it. And there's considerable disagreement around how to do this. Not just on a sort of political level or party political level, but very much also on the everyday, day-to-day level, where how to live with these things is a difficult matter. It's far from obvious how to do it. On a more personal note, I'm also coming into this from having done a 3-year EU project, a so-called training network, Marie Curie training network, in which we had 15 PhD students taking on a series of challenges related to rethinking design practice in the context of digitalization. And what's particular about this project was that we tried to cut not just across discipline, but also across levels or layers of technology use. So ranging from the sort of bottom basics or algorithmic layers to matters of governance and policy. And we'll structure this in terms of a series of integrated challenges where we had PhD, between 2 and 4 PhD students in each group, working, try to think of design as existing in a space between, on one hand, individual interactions, the one-to-one relations that we have, but also the many-to-many relations that these technologies open up for. And if you're curious about what came out of this, there's, for instance, this book, open access book available that you can take a look at. But what I'm going to try to talk about is that having been through these matters of rethinking and reimagining design in relation to the challenges we now face, and thinking about design as involved in making visible, but making sensible, making accessible, making possible. Um, I've been asking myself, what is it that we actually try to rethink here? And also, what is so familiar and self-evident in a sense that it's hard to see and we therefore ignore it? So I've been trying to poke around in things that I tend to take for granted and see what happens, what's going on there. And that's what I like to tell a story about. So I'm going to show you only familiar things, I think. And I'm not going to try to drive a particular sort of argument or conclusion from this, but it's meant, as with so many stories we tell each other, to be an opportunity to reflect, to think about this in relation to your own practice, and think to what extent ideas like the ones I'm going to describe here might or might not be embedded also in your own work. So to tell this story, I'm going to make use of the historical fact that design came into existence about in a time not too different from our current time, in the sense that it was also a time of massive technological change, industrialization, which led to disruptive transformation of the ways people live and work, and where we also had this realization that there was no going back, and yet no agreement where to go next. So it was a very interesting time, just where ideas were formed in how to deal with this that was increasingly unbearable, while at the same time having little obvious to build on and a real need to rethink things. But to understand these design beginnings, we need to start before industrialization. So I'm going to have two trajectories, as I said. And the first one, I have to have a name for things, I'm going to call a new unity. Are you with me so far? It's okay. Thank you. So if we look at making, because this is a lot to do with making and the relation between making and using, and how what it is like to design or make something for someone. This is an image from a book by George Sturt. It's called The Wheelwright's Shop from 1923. And it's a very detailed account of the art of making wagons, wheels, carts. I'm going to read a quote from him regarding what it was like to make these things. He says, "We got curiously intimate with the peculiar needs of the neighborhood. In farm wagon or dung cart, barley roller, plow, water barrel, or whatnot, the dimensions we choose, the curves we followed, and almost every piece of timber was curved, were imposed by us by the nature of the soil in this or that farm, the gradient of this or that hill, the temper of this or that customer, or his choice perhaps in horseflesh." So in this context, there was an intimate unity of the work. The craft and the use were connected constantly. The people making the things knew in detail often who it were they were making from. And there was sort of this relation between making and using. So what happens with industrialization is that this unity is lost. When machines start producing things, there is this difference now between creating and producing or manufacturing. There's no longer this obvious or given unity to the work being done from start to finish by one and the same group of people. Instead, we have things cut up. Even the very idea of mass production for mass consumption is a cutting up of the relationship between the ones who make and the ones who use. And this led to a profound aesthetic crisis, not just in the sense of how to understand making in the context where things are not only made by people, but by machines. But also because the way that we've understood making was fundamentally challenged. So to give an example that was very debated at the time, ornament. ornament used to be an expression of excessive labor, of having wealth, perhaps, to spend on the time it takes to craft something that elaborate. But with a machine, any form is equally almost easy to produce. So in the first period of industrialization, there was this massive reproduction of super ornamented things that used to be an expression of luxury or wealth, and now became this just excessive ornamentation with no relation to the sort of the craft or the quality of the things. Cheap materials replaced genuine ones, and often former material were poor quality. So there was not only was there a disruption in terms of the unity of the process, but also of the objects as such. They were sort of put together in ways that sometimes didn't make sense and was not necessarily poor quality. So a number of things started to happen, and especially in the late 20s, 1920s and 30s. And I'm going to use a couple of examples here. So this is a picture of the Stockholm exhibition in 1930. It was a huge event intended to provide an idea about what a modern welfare state might look like, what Sweden as a welfare state might look like, and engaged also aspects of life and living, from housing to how urbanization would be dealt with and so on. And in connection to this, there was a publication called Experio, in which an idea about how to go about designing for this new life would be. And I just want to show you some examples here. Let me read it. It is not difficult to see that the essentially moral opposition that exists between the concepts of technology and art must be based on the cultural situation during the first brutal phase of industrialization. Today, the cultural position is different. Industrialism is the major factor in new culture if we want one. We must accept it to be able to use it for our own good. To see our situation clearly and arrive at a new fruitful conception, we must cleanse ourselves of the old, purely aesthetic perspectives that in reality we have outgrown. So there's a strong sense that the only way is forward, but it needs to find out what that forward is. And if we look at the kinds of examples they're also discussing, what they're facing here is they struggle with a sort of design or societal context. We're trying to apply what we know to what is new. So this is a beautiful example of a steam engine that is made to look like a Greek temple. And we're trying to figure out how what is new can be given form. And it has to be something else. The Greek temple is not a good form, not a good expression for a machine. And so they state things like, by style, we must then mean the ways and forms in which the needs of the age and the way in which people live find adequate expression. This is not adequate expression. When we have come so far that we no longer conceive of the aesthetic as something that comes from above to merge with the technical, which is of lower origin, but regard every form that does not offer a satisfactory expression of its function as quite simply deficient, then we will have provided the general conditions for a general style of our time. And this is an idea that we'll see pop up in many places. A super influential exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1934, machine art, gave very similar statements. So I'll read this one too. The difference between craft and the machine lies in the spirit and convention as much as in the actual method of manufacture. Tools and simple machines have always been used. The potter's wheel and the hand loom are machines. Modern equipment is merely more efficient and complex. But whether the designer sits at the loom and works up the pattern as he weaves, or whether a motor weaves and the designer sits in an office, the actual work is by machine. A man at a hand loom can weave a rug of a machine-like simplicity. A glassblower can make laboratory beakers as well as picturesquely shaped vases. But the craft spirit does not fit an age geared to machine technique. Machine-made imitations of craft objects are parodies, and the real handicrafts have lost their original vigor. I'm also going to pick another one here that connects back to the comment from Axel regarding that the culture, we need to accept sort of the industrialization as part of culture and move beyond it rather than back from it. Today, man is lost in the far more treacherous wilderness of industrial and commercial civilization. On every hand, machines literally multiply our difficulties and point to our doom. If, to use LP Jack's phrase, we are to end the divorce between our industry and our culture, we must assimilate the machine aesthetically as well as economically. Let me just see who was in the chat so I won't miss anything. Oh, that was so throughout these explorations, what we now call modernism, we can therefore clearly see that some ideas begin to stabilize around the insight that we must somehow overcome the divide between art and technology and find a way of living with machines as part of our culture. And so what happens is that the art, design, the culture sector starts to looking for what unity will replace the unity that the crafts had. How do we think about creating a meaningful whole now that we have distributed manufacturing, we have machines making part of what humans used to do? How do we find that meaningful whole? How do we find that unity that will allow us to see things as inherently unified or meaningful wholes and not just assemblies of things that actually do not fit? There's also the realization that that unity needs to be found and based or very closely related to the characteristics and inherent qualities of the tools and machines that were used. So it has to be in line with what tools and machines are like. So out of this, we get what we now are super familiar with. The clean surfaces, the effective design, and the efficiency in use, and the interest in materials like metal, glass, and plastics, later on composite materials. So we get the sort of, which is often described as in this form and function relation, but perhaps more accurately, it's about, on one hand, a unified surface and a unified experience. And that's where the new sort of meaningful whole or the unity is with respect to aesthetics. And this we've heard so many times that it's almost difficult to not think, yeah, we know. But there is something going on here as well that is perhaps less obvious. And that has to do with the use of both tools and machines. And if you're in the quotes that I read, you see both used, and they are often used together. And at this time, they were quite close to each other. They were the tools and the machines, both were associated with industry, both with efficiency, had both these material qualities that we're looking at. And if you look at the catalog, for instance, at the machine art, you would see both machines and tools. But there is something else. There's also a difference between the two. And the same year as the MoMA exhibition, Louis Mumford published his famous book on techniques and civilization. And he makes the following remark. The essential distinction between a machine and a tool lies in the degree of independence in the operation from the skill and motive power of the operator. The tool lends itself to manipulation, the machine to automatic action. And this is where it gets interesting. While simple machines and tools have much in common, they're also inherently different kinds of things. And what happens, I think, or this is my current thinking, is by combining them, by combining ideas from both, you get the skill manipulation and individual control from the tool idea, and you get the automation and the performance of tasks associated with machines. And these two combined gives you a sense of control, individual skill, even manipulation, but at the same time, automation, machine performance, and all that. And in the beginning, it doesn't matter so much that these are quite different things, because the objects that designers work with are fairly simple. They have few functions, they have few materials, they are not overly complicated. And so it all begins quite well. But if we jump to the time where the industry started to begin with more complex products, it gets interesting. So this is the radio T1000, I think it's called, right? Yeah. Designed by Dieter Rams for Brown in the 60s. So it's late, but it's during that period where technology, design, aesthetics, as we still know, and thinking about how phones look like, for instance, come to being. So we have, on one hand, as we see in this picture, the clean surfaces, the raw materials, the tool-like quality of the thing. You can operate it like this as a device. But because of the more complex functionality, it also has this side to it, where it opens up and reveals a range of different controls. It's actually a universal radio. So the idea was that you would be able to listen in on any kind of radio internationally. It's not here in the picture, but that compartment that's on the back side of the hatch there was meant to hold the manual. And as you can see on the thickness of that compartment, it was a very substantial instruction manual to this. So we have on one hand, the sort of the sleek machine-like withdrawal, where it's meant to operate on its own and you just put it on and it does what it does. But you can also open it up and it reveals its sort of skill manipulation and tool qualities. So, for instance, Dieter Rams articulated his ideas about design somewhat later in the 70s. And if you're in design, you'll probably come across his 10 principles of design. And just to remind ourselves what they are and see that tools actually occur here. These ideas that we traced from the 30s. So good design makes a product understandable. Products fulfilling a purpose are like tools. They are neither decorative objects nor works of art. And good design is honest. We have the idea that materials should be it should be kept simple, it should be clean, which is also not try to be something that it isn't, and so on. Back to purity, back to simplicity. But simplicity with respect to what precisely? So if we move on a bit to a sort of next level of massive change in complexity when it comes to devices and design, we can think about, for instance, the emergence of the user interface, the graphical user interface in particular. This is Susan Carey's sketches for the user interface icons that would later become the basic repertoire of icons for Macintosh in 1984. And here we're at the point where what the interface does, or what you do as a user of the tool, has very little resemblance with what the machine does as a machine. So the user interface is based on the idea that working with a computer is working like a desktop. You have files, you have folders, you have trash cans, and you sort of manage your information environment as if it was a desktop. And so on the user interface side, it's oriented around what I do as a user, and how I understand what I'm doing. On the machine side, sort of, something else entirely might be going on. For instance, the way that a computer deals with files is nowhere close to how we think we deal with files at this level. And so this gap begins to grow between how we are sort of the surface and the appearance of the thing is associated with the sort of tool machine idea we have, and what the complexity of the underlying machinery is able to do. So if we fast forward to where we find ourselves at the moment, we can take a look at another music playing device.
Let's talk about audio entertainment from Google. This is Nest Audio. It's a smart speaker that's all about sound. Hey, Google, play my classical playlist. It works in big rooms, kitchen rooms, rooms you're not in. Hey, Google, turn it up. Or whatever room this is. Beethoven. Just the way Beethoven intended. And when you connect two Nest Audio speakers, you get stereo sound. It's like two Beethovens. All right, say you're in the shower and you're listening to something like that. And you want to keep listening while you're getting dressed. Hey, Google, move the music to the bedroom speaker. But let's say you really want to get the party started. Hey, Google, play music on all my speakers. You'd think a sound system to your whole home would cost an arm and a leg. But with Google, it doesn't. Okay, this is getting a little loud. Let's pause here for now. Boom. I know. Cool, right? Google also lets you pick up where you left off in your podcast. Perfect for when you're listening in the car and want to move things to the living room when you get home. Hey, Google, resume my podcast.
The hummingbird typically eats about 2 to 3 times its own weight in food every day.
Wow.
So yeah, listen to anything in any room. That's audio entertainment from Google.
So, as we can clearly see here that this sort of that simplicity that's been the objective for a long time, the clean surfaces, that kind of design aesthetic is still very much present here. But just moving slightly beyond that, we begin to see that it's not that simple anymore, and it's increasingly problematic. So here we go. Another video.
Setting up Google Nest devices is very simple. If this is your first device, you'll need to sign up for the Google Home app and then log in. Adding a device is easy, and the app will actually do most of the work for you all on its own. Just go to the Google Home app and look at the top of the screen. You'll likely see a small bubble with set up new devices or set up 2 devices inside. If you don't see the pop-up, just go to the plus on the top left of the app there and choose set up device, then set up new devices. Click that bubble and follow the prompt. You'll essentially choose which devices to add to the app, and then you'll add the device to your home by connecting it to your Wi-Fi network. You may also be asked to update your firmware. A test sound will confirm the speakers are working, and then you'll assign it to a room in your home so you can use your voice control, and you'll give each speaker a unique name. If you'd like to use 2 Nest Audio speakers as a stereo pair like I have here, you can link them and set the left and the right channels. Here's how. Set the speakers where you want them in the room, and if you haven't already, make sure each one is set up inside the Google Home app. Make sure the smartphone you're using to set up the speaker pair is connected to the same Wi-Fi network as the speakers. Open up the Google Home app and tap on one of the speakers that you want to pair. Tap the settings icon in the top right corner. Tap speaker pair, then next. Now, if you don't see speaker pair, check your other Nest Audio speaker settings. Mine actually didn't show the pairing option for the other speaker. You'll choose which 2 devices you want to make the speaker pair out of, then you'll tap next. You'll also choose which speakers on the left and which speakers on the right to create a proper pair. You'll be prompted to indicate which room your speaker pair is located in. You can choose or create a room, then tap next. You'll give your speaker pair a unique name like living room stereo, and then tap next. If you want, you can also group your Nest Audio speakers with other Google speakers too. Here's how to do that. Open the Google Home app and tap that plus symbol in the top left. Then choose Create Speaker Group. Tap each device you want to add to the group, and a check mark will appear next to it. Tap Next, save a name for your group, and exit.
And here's another video to complicate things a bit further.
If you have a Google Home device at home, you might be wondering how it's always ready for you to say, "Hey, Google." Well, that's because it's always listening. And if you think about that, that might be a little concerning, because what is it listening to? Every one of my conversations? The answer to that is yes, it is always listening, but there are ways through the Google app that you can manage where that information goes and who it's shared with.
Where we want to start is by opening the Google Home app. You're going to tap on your profile picture, and it's going to open up your settings. Here, we're going to click on Assistant Settings. You're going to have to do some scrolling to get down to the bottom of the page, but we're going to click on Your Data in the Assistant. It's going to pop open another page here. We're going to scroll down just a little bit to where it says Audio Recordings On. Go ahead and click on that. It's going to pop open yet another page, and here is where we're going to do some removing. Where it says Include Audio Recordings, go ahead and click to remove that. And it's going to make you read some stuff. Go ahead and read it. Make sure you know what you're doing, and then click Stop Saving. And essentially what this is doing is It's not going to allow Google to review your audio recordings from what you say. So say you say, hey, Google, what's the weather? It's not going to record those and let Google review those. And that's how you stop it.
If you have other devices like an iPhone, Android, or maybe even an Amazon Alexa, we do have step-by-step at 3. 2, if you have other devices, maybe like an iPhone, Android, or even an Amazon Alexa, we do have step-by-step directions on how you can lock those down as well. Just head over to our website, mbc-2.com. Thanks for watching.
I hope your video didn't lag too much, but I guess it did. Sorry about that. So with examples like this, you can clearly see that the kind of idea is not very different from that Dieter Rams radio from the 60s, that you have the clean surface, the simplicity of it, and the ability to go deeper with the detailed control in the. It's just that the way that this has been developing over time means that the way that we think it works when we encounter that simple surface and the way it works underneath is getting increasingly different from each other. So trying to figure out or trying to work with this and understand what's going on here. Heather Wilson and I, for instance, did some work on trying to figure out the ontology of digital things. And we came up with some concepts that to describe this. And I just want to share 2 of them, fluid assemblages and multi-intentionality. The fluid assemblages we used to describe the fact that now these objects are not stable, not fixed, not determinate, but rather very open things almost produced in runtime. Of course, not everything about my smartphone is produced in runtime, but considerable amounts of what it does and how it appears to me is actually done in runtime. But when we have this sort of idea about the local one-to-one interaction, this is typically what we see or what's going on. This is the part of the machine that we see. And it still appears as some kind of tool to us where we are in control, we sort of manipulate it to our will. But it's really much, much more complicated than that. This is the map, the anatomy of an AI system, the Kate Crawford, and I don't remember the name, but it was on the previous page, produced a couple of years ago. And it clearly shows just how vast these technological infrastructures are. And they, even though we try to understand them as machines, they are really not just that. But what it has opened up for is what we call a kind of multi-intentionality. So a concept from post-phenomenology is multi-stability, and it accounts for how objects, most things that we have around, do not have just one function. We can decide to use them differently. The chair that I'm sitting on is designed to be a chair, but there's I can, if I want to, use it for other things, like a doorstop, or I can use it to stand on to reach higher and whatnot. And in that sense, they have not just one stable function, but they are multi-stable. And we can shift it and understand it's something else. But what's going on here is something quite different. And we call it out as multi-intentionality because it seems to be the case that something that I approach as being one thing is being approached by others as something very different. It provides different versions of itself to different people. And one of the more radical versions of this is when we look at some of the platforms we use constantly, like Facebook, which to me, as an ordinary user, presents itself as a way of connecting with friends in the world, way of sharing, communicating, staying in touch, and so on. Whereas if I'm a company coming to Facebook, it presents itself as a platform for communication, for influence, for increasing online sales, increasing your brand awareness, and driving more traffic to your website, which is quite different. And with Google, it's the same, right? So on one hand, we have this very simple, all you do is search. It's a simple user interface with a bar, and it's like obvious what this thing is doing. I mean, you type a prompt and you get search results. But again, if you come into this from another side, it's a very different story. It's about how you advertise, reach your target audiences, and sort of based on behavior prediction models, get maximum efficiency out of your sort of advertising and communication. So on one hand, it's made to look very familiar, simple, and so on the other hand, it's something very different underneath. So to conclude this story, this is an ad for a Brown speaker a few years ago, where it's clear that they sort of reimagine their new intelligent speakers on basis of the traditional speakers that they have. We can see it's almost emphasizing that everything's the same. Of course, it can do new things, but it's also the same. It's almost identical. And we can compare this to an image that was in that Experio manifesto that I used in the beginning, where they compare the first car and the last carriage. And this idea we're struggling with inherently new technologies by giving them form that is very similar or identical to what we're used to in the past. And it really hides what is different and what's new about them. So now I'm going to tell you a second trajectory. It begins in the same place and ends in the same place, but it has a slightly different dimensions to it. So this is also about how making and using things relate to each other over time. And if we go back to this carriage, this cart, and the agrarian culture or the agrarian society and the making and using that was centered around, there is this almost reciprocal relationship between making and using. It goes back and forth, and especially if we look at something like repair, there's certain things that I would do as a user of the things, and certain things that I will go back to the maker to have help with. And to use a classical example from technology and the hammer as a tool. If we take this hammer, it's one from our workshop here. You can see that it has a very old head and it also has a very quite old shaft. But this is a hammer that my father-in-law made for my wife when she was very young. So he took the head of an old hammer and then created a shaft that was fitting for her strength and size to use. And this is kind of typical for old tools, that it would have components that would require a certain kind of craftsperson to do, like the head here of the hammer. But there were other parts of it that you would configure yourself and fix yourself. There was even a cycle to this. If you think about the yearly cycle of using tools in agriculture, it would be using them during the spring, summer, and autumn, and then fixing them up during the winter. Sometimes taking them back to when bigger repairs was necessary, but also doing certain things yourself. But when we move into the industrial production, this sort of cyclic reciprocal understanding of time changes into something quite different. First of all, it becomes linear. It becomes a process of moving from A to B, where things are designed, conceptualized, produced, distributed, and then later consumed. It also creates sort of a split. There's no continuity necessarily between making and use in the sense there was before, as we talked about. And this is not just about industrial production. It's also about how machines work and how machines make us think. A machine is something that takes something as input, it does something with it, and then produces a result. I mean, if you think about a washing machine, for instance, you put the stuff in there, you start it, and then after a while, it's done its thing, and you take it out again. So much design methodology has actually developed to overcome this gap, to try to connect use and design in various ways. So we might think about it as a kind of a spectrum here between anticipating use before it can happen versus leaving design decisions to a later stage for users to determine themselves exactly how to do it. So if we think about participatory design, co-design, and these kinds of methodological orientations, they have, to a considerable degree, they are about moving people that eventually become users upstream in the process, to have influence. If we're thinking about the sort of political aspect, the democratic aspect of doing design, having the people affected by the designing brought in when the decision making is happening has been a key sort of idea. And it is very much based on this idea that we're moving fairly linearly. And that is not to say we cannot do iterations. We can do a lot of iterations here, but it's still the idea we need to bring people on earlier on in the process. So that there's a certain temporality here that is, when you see it like this, obviously very different from the temporality of craft. So where we're going now with the technologies that I just showed is to a much more repetitive structure, where the sort of iterations happen increasingly quick. And if we start with that idea that, or that notion that I mentioned with the fluid assemblages, is that these things are literally produced in runtime. They're configured based on data like position, user, sensory data, and so on, to be specifically here and now, as detailed as possible. You get a very different temporality again. And if you combine this with the shifting production and design methodologies involved, I mean, for instance, like Agile, with massive A/B testing and super frequent releases, you have technologies or devices building the user experience in runtime. So instead of that linear sort of time from A to B that was typical of early industrialization, we're beginning to see something perhaps like this, where we have massively overlaid process of design and use, where use determines the next iteration of design, like what we do with our browsers determine what search results we're going to get next, ranging from that to bigger things. So massively repetitive. And we're also moving from a stage where we're not having more personal relations between design and use, or even groups of people doing it, but also where machines are involved, not just on one side, but on both sides. So on the design side, we might think about everyday examples, such as how machines might configure our listening habits or provide us with the things we think or that can be predicted that we need. But it's also actually on the consumption side, in the sense that AI sort of, for instance, technologies are used to generate social media flow. So I found this example, I find it kind of interesting, that unless you feel that you're sort of able to keep up with your social media posting, you could have sort of an AI agent help you have the speed, make enough postings. And we have quite frequent examples now where it's clear that it's actually machines communicating with each other on platforms that were initially intended for people. So if we think about this situation and the issue of sort of democracy and the sort of decision around distribution of what's possible, sensible, visible, and so on, where would we go for influence? What is the appropriate place and time for participation? It used to be like that we moved upstream to have more influence. We moved users into the design process and so on. So where do we do it now? And it's been sort of an idea for a long time that there's also the side of use that allows to where we can have freedom. For instance, we choose what to use, we choose how to use it, we can decide not to use certain things and so on. So there's been these two sides. But if we look at what's going on with that, there's something happening in that end as well. So we take that sort of record player as an example. It's also, I mean, of course, it's being used to consume music the way intended, listening to records and so on. But it's also been appropriated and used for other ways. becoming sort of a musical instruments and the basic musical instrument for whole musical genre, as in rap and hip hop. Even the cassette player, which is more sort of packaged, less access compared to a record player, has sort of this ability when people are experimenting with doing various kinds of things with it. But the further we go in this sort of turning things more and more into machines that withdraw more and more automatic action, where we do less and the machines do more, the less accessible these things get. So already with the CD, it's kind of hard to manipulate the sound, the music. And with services like the one we have now, we cannot really do much of anything with the music we're listening to. So I might say that, well, we still have the option to say we're not going to use this. We're going to sort of refrain. We're going to say that exercise the freedom not to be part of it, not to use it. But even that is getting increasingly difficult with some of the things. And this is a series of investigative reports by concerning the what it's like to live without the big five. And in this study, she first went to blocking one at a time and then finally blocked all of them. And it turns out that it's actually this idea that we still have the freedom to not participate, to not use, is actually really, really difficult to exercise. So I like to end this story by this quote. Today's world is a world of machines. We live among machines. They help us with everything we do in our work and recreation. But what do we know about their moods, their natures, their animal defects, if not through arid and pedantic technical knowledge? Machines reproduce themselves faster than mankind, almost as fast as the most prolific of insects. They already force us to busy ourselves with them, to spend a great deal of time taking care of them. They have spoiled us. We have to keep them clean, provide them with nourishment and rest, continually tend to them, and meet their every need. In a furious time, we will become their little slaves. Do you have any idea where this comes from? I'll show you the rest of it. This is from Bruno Munari, one of the first industrial designers in Italy in 1938. So we're back in the 30s. And this idea that machines are something we need to appropriate. But you can see that there's a lot of similarities here. And so to ask this question to be continued, where does this lead? And I think one of the questions that comes up to me is really, how does a given design help us grasp the bigger picture of what using something really is? And how do we collectively govern how use unfolds? And it's not so much that tools and machines are not useful concepts. I mean, they really are. But I think they have gotten combined in a way. We have this sort of combination of the tool and the machine that made us that seemed so powerful that we would have the skilled control, the manipulation, and the tool-like qualities and the sort of the machine automation has really created a situation where a lot of things that we need to attend to are hidden. They're not visible. And we may wonder what to do. I think we need to consider how this is going. So for instance, we can address the sort of consequences of the tool machines, and think that, okay, so let's reconsider the use of smooth surfaces and think about also the more inconvenient ones, the ones that would reveal more. We can perhaps not be just focused as me completing my task, me getting what I need as quickly as possible, but also me understanding what am I actually doing? What is the bigger picture of what I'm doing here? We might question the idea that experiences need to be immersive. I need to be enforced in what I want to get out of this. I need to be enforced in what's important to me all the time. And instead think about, but these experiences also need to be much less insular. They need to be opening up so we actually understand what's going on here. And we might think about the individual choices that we make and how relatively powerless they've become. Of course, we can say, no, I won't accept this terms of service, or I won't use this service, or I won't use it like this. But in practice, the way that these things are networked, the way that they have the sort of the platforms work, means that individual choice is more or less irrelevant in many cases. And we might therefore ask, okay, do we need to work on continuous collective influence instead? And that is something we work with in design upstreams. We have worked with that, making co-design, making participatory design, when we had a sort of basic linear time at the bottom. But without that linear time, where do participation now happen? What happens as use unfolds? Because that's where many of these problems happen. And that is not something that we have currently. Or we might need to do something else entirely. Is this idea more or less hidden idea that we are working with this sort of tool machine aesthetic still, even though we've thought we've left it? Do we need something else instead? Do we need a design aesthetics that has a different foundation, much like in the 30s and 20s, when they first conceptualized this way of thinking about design aesthetics? They picked something that was characteristic and inherent to the machines they faced. Our machines are very different. Perhaps they're not even machines in the sense we used to think about them. They're certainly not tools in the way that we used to think about tools. And so what else be there? Or that's of course also a possibility that I'm just telling stories about lingering modernism, and that these ideas are already obsolete in a sense, and we don't have to worry about them. I just have a feeling we do have to worry about them. So with that, I'd like to hear what you think, and if you have questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Really interesting presentation here, and I do think that it will spark some interesting discussion and questions. So if you put down, yeah, perfect. We already have a hand up, and that is Lucy Kimball. So please, Lucy, be first, and I'll try to just get everybody in the same screen as when you're speaking. So, well, please, Lucy.
Thank you, Johan. That was very interesting. Sorry, I missed the beginning. You talked about sort of upstream and downstream, but of course it's multi-dimensional as you've shown us. Is there a case now for designers or people with expertise in design, including this critical thinking, in the regulation? So the design of regulations and laws that might put some boundaries around some of these techno assemblages. And that's the first question, is sort of going sort of, I don't even know if regulation is upstream or downstream, but it's sort of somewhere. And then secondly, in this world where Trump is effectively co-running the American government, and in a geopolitical context of what we're hearing on an every day around trade challenges and so on, where there is not necessarily, we can't assume the sort of Western liberal market-based set of agreements about laws, international trade, international law. These things may not hold. These are fragile before a kind of consensus, but may not hold for the next 5 to 10 years. So the regulation stuff may be therefore irrelevant. So in that scenario, what's the revolutionary potential for designers?
Well, super question. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I wish I knew. I would, for the first question, I mean, also thinking about the work that you've been doing in relation to policy and design and so on, I think that is an area that's really emerged and quite strongly, and where we begin to understand how that could work. What I think I'm wondering about here is what happens in between that and the sort of one-to-one or the individual interactions that we have? Is there something in between here that we can also take a look at? That's not regulation or legal frameworks or policy at the most sort of more general levels. And that's not individual choice in these sort of completely determined sort of one-to-one interactions. We're always logging in, always being individualized and identified as individuals. Is there something in between those two where when we have everyone and just someone that could be interesting to work with? And I think there is. I think there's something about collectives of various sizes worth exploring here. And if we think about how design has evolved methodologies in involving people that may be representatives, that may be sort of specific groups we work with and so on, there is the sense somewhere of working at different scales of participation. And I think what do we need to do to activate such sort of in-between scales now that we're moving on? And the reason I use the term downstream is perhaps, I mean, it's multidimensional, as you say, of course, but I think I think there is somehow often in design we still sort of have a like implicit assumption that what happens in the beginning is more important. So we're really concerned about, you know, the setting up, the first part, the getting going. But much of what's problematic about these technologies has to do with what happens as the use unfolds, what happens over time. And somehow we need to tend to the later stage. I think sustainability is a super example of that, where you cannot just have your focus on where things begin. You have to also account for where they end. So that would be my sort of immediate reaction to the first question. And then the second one, how to deal with the fragility of this. I think one of the things that we seriously need to consider or reconsider is the complete withdrawal of everything that we can claim ownership to through use. I mean, even if the record player is far from a musical instrument in terms of how you control the making of sound. I mean, it's not like you perform. You still have an influence of the device that is difficult to remove from you. You can still sort of move the thing. You can touch it. You can do things with it. Obviously, if you've seen DJs performing, they can do things that you couldn't possibly believe was possible. But with the increasing automation, the increasing machine-like in the machine side of the tool machine spectrum, the increasing withdrawal makes less and less available for any kind of manipulation. It's even that, you know, when there's an update, even the way you've structured your own pictures on your phone has changed. You don't, I mean, you have little influence or no influence over exactly how that. So I think from a design point of view, this is where we begin to, I think we need to question the just how much of the sort of the efficiency, the smoothness, the simplicity are we willing to pay for in terms of lack of access, lack of things. So for instance, if we think about the fragility, I mean, one thing I think we really need to take a look at is who actually owns the data that we're producing and how is that governed? And I think, for instance, the work on data commons is quite interesting and how that becomes sort of, it's not that it's at least the question of where everything that we generate, where it sits, who has ownership, who has influence, who has a say in what the data is being used for. And that's currently super asymmetrical at this point. And that's also somewhere we can do. But in terms of the fragility of the world at the moment, I mean, you know, it's hard to come to grips with, isn't it?
Great, thank you for that question or reflection. We'll get on to Gerolf, please.
Thank you. Thanks for a brilliant talk. Covered a lot of ground, of course. You mentioned the lingering modernism at the end, and I think I pretty much can agree on that. I think there's quite a strong understream. But I was thinking about there are some factors that perhaps might counter what you're describing, and that is the increasing network of experts that you have. I mean, even if I, as a person, cannot understand my phone, If I go to the right internet groups, etc., you will find experts on the smallest of ships anywhere, and you can actually do this with a lot of things. So I think that's sort of a countering factor that perhaps could be part of the to be continued. I mean, obviously, like you described, once we had hammers, we all had hammers, and we all knew how to operate them. But now we have very complex systems, but we have also much huger collective knowledge about them. So I think that's, you might perhaps turn that into a question that you can comment on.
Very, very relevant remark and question. No, I mean, obviously what I can cover in a short lecture like this is super simplified, and it's way more complicated than this. And it's not my intention to be overly simplistic, but I think if I think it's worth sometimes trying to paint these bigger pictures just to get access to certain kinds of issues to discuss. But of course, it's not this simple. It's complicated, and there's not just this sort of direction or trajectory in design. There are also very many other things, and there is, I mean, for instance, I'm arguing that we're still struggling with linear time as kind of a machine-based thinking on how things unfold. But of course, there are other sort of models in design, well established circularity and so on. So I don't think the question is so much whether there are alternatives or not. I think there are. I think the question I'd like you to think about, or that I'm struggling with at least, is just how much of this is still present when we look for these new possibilities. I mean, when we try to envision where we go next, imagine like we're watching the sky and thinking, oh, we should go here. How much of this that we carry with us make us look in certain directions but not others? And that's why I'm interested in trying to unpack them, because when we try to rethink design practice, when we've been through these different things that we've been in Decode, for instance, I have a feeling that there is a structure to where we go looking. And some of that is kind of known to us, and we can work with that, we can question it and so on. But some of it is just so obvious that we don't really. So, I mean, that's, I think, I don't have a good answer to that's what be my answer to your question. I think that it's not like it is like this. It's just a question of how much of critical questioning do we need to do of the very familiar to not limit ourselves too much when we think about the alternatives, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Makes sense. We can have one last reflection from Fergus before we wrap this seminar up. So please, Fergus.
Yeah, mine relates probably to both the two other questions, but I was super intrigued by this, the situating in things in the 1930s in the Stockholm exhibition. Because what I was wondering, and it very much relates to your last point, is are we trying too much to solve the current anxiety by revisiting, an attempt to funnel it through modernism and with reference to Dieter Rams? But I was just sort of curious if we think about the politics of the time that we're in now, I think the stuff that Lucy was alluding to as well. Can we see all of this as just an attempt to handle the anxieties that we're facing in the same way that the 1930s had its first round of industrialization anxiety, and this was managed to be channeled, at least in the case of the Stockholm exhibition, into a very progressive sense of how we could use the financial gains from industrialization, but all the kind of tools that it afforded us to create a new Swedish home and this progressive view. So I suppose my question is, how do we develop that more positive frame, but maybe also not be looking back as to how Dieter Rams did it, to develop a kind of maybe more ambitious sense in the way that you were talking about? How do we not just keep trying to funnel this through the lenses that we've used in the past? But I guess I was wanting you to talk maybe a bit more to the politics of the time, and are there patterns that we're seeing now with the anxiety we have about AI to the anxieties that people were having in the 30s about plastic as a technology or whatever whatever their concerns would be, industrialization of society, I guess it was.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence that I picked examples from the 30s. It was a politically complicated time and a contested one. And I think there are some similarities with what we're facing today. And I think there are two things. Just I'm going to realize I need to be super brief here. But there are two things, I think, to learn from this, from going back and looking at that. The first one is that they didn't know either. They realized that they were facing technologies that had a massive influence on how they lived and worked and had the potential to transform society into something better. But the way things were going at the moment was not necessarily that. So if we take the political dimension in the Swedish context, the formation of design in Sweden and the idea about design, architecture, and the welfare state is very closely aligned with the formation of the social democratic movement, for instance. So there are things going on at the same time. Women's voting rights is another piece of the puzzle there. Several things going on at the same time. And the other thing that I think it's important to see is that they also had the difficulty of trying to figure out how you get through this change, not by repeating what we know and trying to package what's new within, familiar forms, but actually try to figure out what is now required that is different from that. And I think we're facing something similar. We have also a transformative and highly contested technological change going on that's also a very political one. And we also try to figure out how to deal with it. And currently, we're dominated by attempts to fit it into existing known categories to make what we know works also with this. And with perhaps what I try to encourage to show here is to say that, well, yeah, it sort of works, but it's also sort of doesn't. And I think we're getting to a breaking point where some of the ideas that has governed our design aesthetics, implicitly and explicitly, needs to be changed. And personally, I think that the machine as a notion has served us super well for almost 100 years in navigating how to rethink design in relation to technology. But I don't think it works anymore. I think we need something else. And if we can continue to have a tool machine idea as a basis for how we navigate possibilities, we're not going to see those. So the question is, what do we do instead? And that, I think, is what I encourage you to think a bit about. What do you agree? Do you disagree? And if you think there's something to it, what would you do about it? Where can you see sort of this idea that you have what you're designing, it has a surface layer in which you have key points where you have manipulation and control, and an enormous backside that does things that you normally don't even care about. So how often in designing, I mean, even designing services, do we think like that? Well, a lot of the time, actually. And it comes from somewhere. And the question is, can we allow it to continue to just be like that, or do we need to rethink that? Because it's not the only way to think about these things. There are also other ways.